Good evening, everybody. Hello, Charlie fans. I'm Anusch Yazdani, and I'm the medical director of Charlie. And tonight, I'm joined on the Charlie couch by the wonderful Ali Mills.
Thanks.
Thanks you very much for coming and joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Ali's going to talk to us about grief, which is something that we don't normally talk about, in fact, in fertility. But it is, as we were talking about today, so all-pervasive and really important. So, Ali, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So thanks for having me.
Okay.
I am a grief counsellor, so I have over a decade of experience with grief, loss and bereavement, and I have certainly had my own fertility experience that I think informs the practice that I have. I've worked in many not-for-profits, so palliative care, oncology, hospice care, family separation with children and young people, and certainly with sudden and traumatic losses as well, and in the perinatal period. So lots of loss, which is not really what you want to tell people when you catch a flight or when you fill in your passport coming back in, but I think it's a beautiful space.
How did you come into this space?
I actually started in aged care when I was a student, and I was on my way to be an occupational therapist, and I found that I really enjoyed talking to people and hearing people's stories, and that people have a want to be seen, to be heard, and I had a skill at being in that space. And I guess I've had some loss experiences in my own life, which is often the case when you meet other bereavement practitioners, and I think it's just led me on a path of going into grief and loss, I guess, going into a space that people often, as you say, run away from because it makes us really deeply uncomfortable, but it's privileged work, I would say.
And Ali, you've started your own, you're the founder of the Grief Guide, which please, we'll put links on there, but if you have time to check this out, it's absolutely amazing, thegriefguide.com.au.
Yes.
What made you do that?
I just want to do the work. I want to reach more people. I feel like I'm on a little bit of a mission to get people talking about grief. You know, we exist in a culture that doesn't do grief well, even when it's what I would say kind of clear cut, when there is someone that's died, where there's a body to mourn. It makes us really deeply uncomfortable. We don't talk about it. We often avoid people who are grieving. Our systems don't support grief. We allow people to kind of grieve for, I don't know, a couple of days. You get one day bereavement leave or something happens and you're meant to wrap it all up and continue on with your world. And certainly if we're doing that for death-related losses, we are certainly not supporting non-death related losses. So the kind that, of course, we're going to go into in this conversation around fertility, or for me, every challenging life experience has many losses that sit underneath it, whether it's the loss of identity, the loss of relationship, the loss of connection, the chronic health challenges, the experience of pain, the watching your parents age. Really, the limit doesn't exist when it comes to grief and loss, and there is such a need to help people to feel seen, heard and valued in their experience. So I just want to do that, and so that's where Grief Guides come from. So moving out of the organisational space into my own, which is really exciting. Yeah.
And so tell me, what is grief? How do you define grief?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned, I guess I have a really holistic view of grief, where it's a universal experience. We all have grieved, are currently grieving, we will grieve in the future. It's a non-linear process. So the idea of, you've probably all heard of the stages of grief.
I was going to say, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I always thought it was a linear process, isn't it?
No.
I'm getting angry at some point,
That's right.
and then
you get to closure.
and then I get to close, and then it's all fine. Yeah.
No.
Okay.
It is different. It's an individualized experience. So no two people are going to grieve the same way, and no individual is going to grieve two different loss experiences in the same way. It is really, there is no right or wrong way to grieve. It's what you're needing to do to respond to a grief experience. So I realize that I'm saying a lot of what it's not, but it's different. Some people are going to be more intuitive in their grief, which means they're going to be more of the feelers. They're the people that are going to mourn in a way that we would see as traditional, in that the sadness, the talking, the sitting in your grief, they're going to be intrinsic grievers, who are the thinkers or the doers, and everything in between. There's a whole range of how you're going to respond to a grief experience, and it's all encompassing. So it's going to impact you emotionally, behaviorally, socially. It's going to have an existential element. It's certainly going to impact your cognitions as well. So it's kind of, this thing happens to you, it shatters your world, and the response to that is going to be different for all of us.
So is grief synonymous with loss? Is it always loss?
It's a loss of something.
Okay.
So I would say there are often many different losses. So if we go into the fertility space, there are a huge number of losses that come from that, and grief is that feeling that accompanies the loss. So whether it's the loss of control, the loss of certainty, the loss of identity, the loss of hope.
Oh my God, that sounds so much like fertility, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah, absolutely. The loss of connection to friends, to your partner, the frustration that you feel, the loss of independence, the reliance on a medical system, you know, the financial implications. I think the list really goes on and on around what losses we're talking about when we're talking about fertility.
Because often when we talk about loss in this space, it's often about the loss of a pregnancy, or it's the loss of a baby. But in fact, the losses are so much more than that, as you were saying, you know.
Yeah, and I think even if I think of a couple of different clients who have had a pregnancy loss, the loss of innocence or the naivety that can come from having a miscarriage or having a pregnancy loss, where suddenly the subsequent pregnancy, if you're lucky to have one, suddenly isn't as joy-filled necessarily. There's that loss of, oh, I just assumed perhaps that I could fall pregnant, and that wouldn't, the outcome would then be that I would have a baby that comes home. For many, that won't be the case, and that can be a really significant loss of, well, now I'm fearful for this entire pregnancy, and I don't really know how to hold this fear and the hope and the joy and everything that comes from this experience that's been tainted, so to speak, by what's unfolded previously. Yeah.
So before we were talking about in this space, often it's not just grief, but there's also a need to keep doing something further and further. And one of the things we often talk about is people are coming for their second pregnancy and having difficulties falling pregnant, and often family members saying, well, you've already got one child, you know, you don't need to worry about this. Obviously, this has got to be much better.
Yeah.
But the experience is no different, is it really?
No, and there are a lot of well-meaning people, and we love to give advice, and I would say anything that starts with an at least or you should, no, that's not helpful, that's not supportive, but there's a lot. It's at least you've had one child, at least you can fall pregnant, at least you're able to afford treatment, or any of those statements doesn't take away that feeling of, but I don't want to be here, and I'm fearful of being here, I don't know what the possible outcome will be. The reality of that experience, and all it does really is push away that person of who's giving you the at least, or you should be happy you've got a child at home, or just anything of that nature. You know, yeah, unhelpful.
Ali, so we're particularly talking about the festive season as we're coming up towards this. Why is that such a big problem?
I think it's a season of shoulds. I think it's a season of you should be merry and bright and happy, and you should be celebrating, and you should be spending time with whoever who perhaps you don't want to spend time with. There's a lot of expectation on what you should feel and what you should do, and I think that is really unhelpful for somebody who is in a challenging circumstance. It doesn't just magically go away because it's Christmas. It's a time where perhaps there's a lot of expectations we have on ourselves that I should be pregnant, I should be bringing a baby home, my baby should be turning whatever age this year. There's a lot attached to this particular moment in time. It's similar when there's different anniversaries or birthdays and those sorts of events, but Christmas is one that for many of us we may have celebrated in the past, and it just doesn't feel like something we want to be celebrating when we are potentially grieving all of those different losses that we've talked about. And
so as we're preparing for the season, what are some of the things that you tell people are helpful, or what is not helpful in this sort of situation? If you're already worried about, you know, I'm going to have to go and see the 15 people in my work group and explain why I'm still not pregnant, or what's happened to the pregnancy, I thought you were pregnant, you know, how do people cope with that?
Yeah, I think it's there's a real need to protect yourself around, do I have to go to everything? Are there some things that I can say actually are not going to serve me on this occasion? Or if I'm going to go to that event, what do I need to put in place? Do I need to have a game plan? So I'll talk a lot with people around what are some things you can say no to that you can protect yourself from. But if you're going to go, what is your plan A of you're feeling great and everything's fine, and what I still think it's worthwhile saying if that changes, if there's a conversation that takes you by surprise or bumps up against your grief, what's your escape plan?
But how do you do that without seeming rude, maybe sometimes, you know, like without shutting other people out immediately, you know, putting the blinds down?
I think sometimes rallying your support system. So whether it's a partner, whether it's a friend, I say bring people with you. Bring someone as almost your bodyguard, a little bit of knowing me well enough that if I'm not okay, maybe we have a signal. I've told people at times, what's your code word for getting them out of there? And sometimes it's helpful to have someone in that role that maybe feels a little bit stronger, that isn't in as vulnerable a place as you, to be able to say, oh, I just got to take them away for a little bit. Maybe it's away from the conversation, maybe it's from the party or whatever event it might be. But I say often it's knowing who your supports are. There are going to be people in your network who might be your practical supports, of who can take care of some things that maybe feel too big for you at this holiday season or generally. Can you rally those people? Who are your people you're going to talk to when the wheels are falling off, when you're feeling overwhelmed? Are there other people that you can rally, whether it's support services or someone to tap into when you're needing extra support? Because yes, it can absolutely feel like you're putting the armour up and you're being rude, but also sometimes it's necessary for protection to be able to just take a break.
And in people, often what we hear in this space is also people who are not only mourning the loss of not being pregnant, but then also the whole family experience that's sort of not there. They feel like there should have been some, or there is something that is missing that's not specifically something tangible like a pregnancy, or there's this whole vibe that sort of goes around Christmas, as you said, that everyone should just be happy and should be jolly and looking around. How do people cope with that?
I think it's
if
often,
you don't have the support networks around
Yeah,
you.
it's often the elephant in the room, isn't it? And we avoid conversations, or we sometimes avoid people that make us uncomfortable. So sometimes what you'll see is this dance that's happening at family dinner of, do we acknowledge the pregnancy? Do we acknowledge the fertility treatment? Do we acknowledge what's happening for someone? Because for the most part, people want to do the right thing. We love our loved ones dearly. We don't want to cause harm, so we avoid talking about the topic. Sometimes it can be helpful to set that expectation of, I'm going through something, I don't want to talk about it, or I'm happy to talk about it, I'd like it to be a normal day. Or sometimes we have to, unfortunately, as the grieving people, sort of set that expectation of how I want this to be done, whether we acknowledge the loss or we don't. That can help to remove the elephant in the room. But I think also creating a ritual sometimes is really helpful in the holiday period of, can you set a table for a loved one who's died? Literally set a table setting for your grief. Sometimes it's around fertility of, you know what, I'm actually going to make a space for this experience that isn't seen, that isn't necessarily understood, but I'm going to bring it into the room in a physical sense, which sounds strange, but for some it can be really
makes
healing.
a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
If you're grieving and you want to talk, but you may have difficulties bringing that up, how does someone bring up, I want to talk to somebody about that? Is it just okay to just come up to say to someone, hey, I'm sad and I'm upset? Are there any particular protocols or any recommendations that you have around that?
With like a family member?
Or anyone, like if you don't have a family member, how do you approach someone at work who may be your closest person that you have, who may not have been aware of what you've been experiencing?
I think it's a gentle approach is helpful, because not everybody who's going through something wants to share. So I think I often talk about giving an invitation of, hey, I've noticed something's happening. I'm not quite sure what is it. Is it something that you'd like to talk about? Is it something you'd like to talk about right now? Because certainly sometimes it's about doing what you need to do to get by. And we all, even when we're grieving at times, need to show up to work. And sometimes it's all that you can do to just keep putting one foot in front of the other. So I love the idea that somebody's noticed that you're not feeling well, or noticed some change and wants to reach out. It isn't about necessarily completely stepping in and forcing somebody to talk or trying to break through that wall, but offering of, are you supported? Can I do something? Is there someone that I can call?
It sounds almost like that "are you okay" sort of experience, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like the day where you have permission to ask people almost about,
The
are
one
you
day.
okay?
Yes.